People ask me why I went. Not my superiors. They understood the order and signed the papers. Not my crew. They had trained for exactly this kind of run and were ready before I'd finished briefing. I mean, the journalists who found me afterward, the committee members who wanted a full account, the young officers in the academy lecture halls, where I was occasionally sent to describe the operation in detail. They all asked the same question in different clothes. Why did you go, Captain Olin? They mocked you. Their council reps stood on the floor of the Galactic Steering Assembly and called your Navy's deep space program the clumsy thrashing of a species that had not yet learned to swim. Why did you go? I give the same answer every time, and it is not the one they expect. But I am getting ahead of myself. You need the context first. The Vetheran are old. Not old the way we sometimes say a species is old. Meaning, they have been in space longer than us, and therefore warrant a kind of diplomatic deference. I mean genuinely old. A civilization that had mapped the floor of their homeworld's methane sea before our ancestors had figured out that fire was a tool rather than a punishment. They are vast creatures, the Vetheran. Smooth gray bodies that move the way deep water things move, slow and deliberate and absolutely at home in pressure that would fold a human being flat. Their echo organs run in two parallel lines down their flanks, bone ridges under the skin that produce and receive sound in registers we can barely instrument. They think in subsonic frequencies. Their philosophy, and they have a great deal of it, is built around the idea that depth equals truth. The deeper you go, the more honest the world becomes. Surface things are shallow things. They had a word for it in their language that I was never taught to pronounce properly, but our liaison team translated it as something like the lightness of those who have not descended. It was not a compliment. They applied it to us. The vote came down 11 years before the Kareth event. Earth had been lobbying for a full seat on the Galactic Steering Council 6 years by that point. Not an observer post, not a provisional membership, a full deliberative seat with floor time and binding vote. We had the support of 4 species, we needed 8. The Vetheran representative, a depth counselor named Oran Velthesk, gave a speech that was 3 hours long, and according to the translators, quite beautiful in the original subsonic register. The summary that reached us was 14 pages. The key passage was half a sentence. That humanity's naval expansion program demonstrated the clumsy thrashing of a species that had not yet learned to swim, and that giving such a species a binding voice in galactic governance would be an invitation for the surface to contaminate the deep. We got 5 votes. We needed 8. I was a lieutenant commander at the time, running convoy logistics on the far rim. I read the summary in a mess hall on the ESV Lantern Road and finished my coffee and went back to work. There was nothing else to do. The rejection was clean and public, and entirely within the council's procedural rights, and being angry about it was a luxury that logistics officers on active deployment could not afford. But I remembered the language. You tend to remember that kind of language. The clumsy thrashing of a species that had not yet learned to swim. I made commander the following year, captain the year after that. Persistent Dawn was my first command. A Consolidator-class relief vessel, 1,200 tons displacement, crew of 84, designed for exactly the kind of operations that the Deep Space Command had been quietly expanding since the Council rejection. Humanitarian response, technical rescue, medical relief at extended range. The brass had decided, somewhere in the years after the vote, that if we were not going to be given a seat by demonstrating our governance credentials, we would earn one by demonstrating something else. We would be the species that showed up, every time for everyone at scale. It was a good strategy. It was also, I think, simply the right thing to do. And those two things being the same thing is rarer than it should be. I had run 7 operations in the 3 years before Kareth. Refugee transports for the Siobhan dispersal, medical response for the Drell mining collapse, engineering support for the Tesfari atmospheric processor failure, that one had taken 6 weeks, and the thanks we received was a 14-word diplomatic cable that our liaison team said was the Tesfari equivalent of a standing ovation. We were getting a reputation. Quiet, unglamorous, reliable, the species that answered. The species that brought more than you asked for, and stayed until the job was done. The Vetheran noticed none of this. as far as anyone could tell. They were busy being the Vethoran. Kareth Station was their pride, their crown, their architectural answer to every species in the galaxy. Who had ever doubted that a civilization built in the deep could build anything that the surface dwellers would call impressive? It sat on the floor of the Vethoran methane sea moon, pressurized habitat structure 3 kilometers across and 4 levels deep, housing approximately 400 members of the philosophical and administrative castes. Their thinkers, their governors, their archivists, and the essential technical staff required to keep all of them alive in an environment that was, by any external measure, deeply hostile. The methane sea was 11 kilometers deep at Kareth's location and maintained an ambient pressure of roughly 260 atmospheres. The station had been operating without a serious incident for 67 years. The incident that broke that record was, as these things tend to be, not one thing. It was 4 things happening in sequence so fast that the engineering team had no time between them to recover. A microfracture in a secondary hull segment, probably from a stress cycle no one had caught in the routine inspection. The fracture propagating to a joint coupling in the external pressure manifold. The manifold failure cascading into the thermal regulation system for the life support processing core, and the thermal fault triggering an automatic lockdown of the primary oxygen recirculation units. A safety protocol designed to prevent a chemical cascade, which it successfully prevented, while simultaneously cutting breathable air circulation to 2 of the station's 4 levels. 91 Vethoran were on those 2 levels. The distress signal went out at 031 station time. I know this because I have the log in front of me, even now in my quarters aboard the persistent Dawn, which has been my home for 8 years, and which I expect will be my home until I am too old to climb the companionway without help. The signal was a standard emergency broadcast on the Galactic Emergency Channel, routed through the Methane Sea's communication relay buoy, and boosted by the emergency transmitter array on Kareth's dorsal spine. It was clear and strong and detailed. They knew how to file a distress report, the Vethoran. Their engineering team had prepared one within 11 minutes of the first hull fracture. The signal reached the Galactic Steering Council relay at Aero 341. It reached 6 of the Vethoran's formal treaty allies within the hour. Species signed mutual assistance compacts. Species with ships already in the region. Species that had voted alongside the Vethoran on 37 of the last 40 council resolutions. The Vethoran had been meticulous about their alliances. 11 years of careful treaty building, philosophical exchange programs and trade agreements and joint defense pacts. They had allies. They had, by any reasonable accounting, more allies than almost any other civilization their size in the local cluster. The signal reached my desk at 0409. I was asleep when it came in. My comms officer, Lieutenant Dreshko, had been on watch and had flagged it as priority and woken me, and I was reading it at my desk in my cabin while a coffee was still brewing. I want to be precise about the timeline because it matters. B500. 43 minutes after I read the report. I had spoken with Admiral Caro at Deep Space Command, requested emergency authorization for an 11-ship response package, received preliminary approval pending logistics confirmation, and begun the process of pulling together the convoy. This was not unusual for us. We had pre-positioned assets for exactly this kind of event because Deep Space Command had been running models on infrastructure failure scenarios in high-pressure environment habitats for 3 years. Kareth-class stations appeared in those models with a frequency that had led someone with foresight to make sure we could respond to one quickly. I had lists. I had contacts. I had a convoy template that needed filling rather than building from nothing. By 0600, I had confirmation on 9 of the 11 vessels. By 0700, all 11 were confirmed and beginning their departure preparations. We had 2 Consolidator-class relief vessels including Persistent Dawn, 3 engineering barges carrying hull patching systems rated for the pressure, environment, a full hospital ship, the ESV Meridian Grace, 400 beds, trauma surgical suite, hyperbaric recovery capacity, which would matter enormously for anyone who had been in a compromised pressure environment for an extended time. 2 logistics transports carrying emergency life support equipment, and spare recirculation units, and 2 Sentinel-class frigates as escort and heavy equipment platforms. We had a submersible team rated to 11 kilometers. We had, as it happened, everything we needed. I put the convoy en route at ZO 722. The Vethoran's closest treaty ally, the Chevrak Confederation, sent their formal response at 1400. It was a beautifully composed diplomatic message expressing profound concern and promising that a preliminary assessment team would be assembled for dispatch within the standard 48-hour mobilization window. The Drevon technocracy, who had ships 2 transit hours from Kareth's moon, sent a message at 1637, noting that their vessels were not rated for the methane sea's operational environment, and that they were in contact with contractors who might be able to assist. The Orvan Religious Council sent prayers. By 1400, my convoy was 6 hours out and accelerating. Tell you about the descent, because it was the part of the operation that none of the committee reports and none of the academy lectures fully captured. You can read a report that says, 11 human vessels entered the atmosphere of the Vethoran methane sea moon at 2100 station time and began the descent to Kareth station, and the report is accurate, but it tells you nothing about what it actually looked like, nothing about what it felt like from the bridge of the persistent dawn, as we went down through 11 kilometers of methane sea toward a pressurized city that was slowly dying on the ocean floor. The moon's sea is not translucent. It is amber, a deep organic amber, the color of old honey or ancient resin, lit from above by the diffused light of the gas giant it orbits. When you enter from the surface, your visibility drops to perhaps 100 meters almost immediately, and then you are navigating by sonar and instrument, and the occasional pulse from the seabed relay network that the Vethoran maintain for exactly this reason. Pressure builds against the hull in ways you can feel rather than hear. A deep, structural settling, like a house shifting in cold weather, except what is settling is your ship, and what is cold is several hundred atmospheres of methane pressing against the outer plating. My submersible team, 8 people in hardened descent suits, had briefed 3 times during the transit. The engineering barge commanders had done the same. Everyone knew their job. This was what we trained for. This was, in the plainest sense, Deep Space Command had built us to do. And still, going down through 11 kilometers of amber methane sea toward a city full of beings who had publicly called us unfit for serious civilization, there was a particular quality to the silence on the bridge. Not tension, exactly. Something more like the stillness that settles over people who understand the weight of what they are doing and have decided to do it anyway. 4 kilometers depth, we picked up Kareth station on sonar. At 3 kilometers, we had visual. The station's emergency lighting system was running, which meant the exterior was lit in the Vethoran's low-frequency emergency band, a deep violet pulsing that showed up on our enhanced imaging as a slow heartbeat in the dark. It was enormous. Even at 3 kilometers, with our imaging doing the heavy work. The scale of it registered. 3 kilometers of pressurized structure, domes and interconnected corridors, and what looked like cathedral volumes of internal space. All of it built for beings that could withstand ambient pressure that would kill us in seconds. All of it, right now, failing. My comm officer opened the channel at 2.5 kilometers. The voice that came back was not what I expected. I had been briefed on Vethoran vocalization. I knew that their subsonic range would be translated by our systems into something approximating their register for us, which in practice meant deep, resonant speech. The frequency of it carrying emotional content in ways that our translators did their best to convey, but could never fully render. What I had not been briefed for was the quality of the voice itself. The Vethoran technical officer who answered our hail was by the translation team's assessment, managing to be completely calm, precise, professional. He gave us the structural status of the station in clear numerical terms. Hull fracture at Sector 7 Delta, pressure manifold integrity at 63%, oxygen recirculation offline for levels 3 and 4, 91 station inhabitants on those levels with estimated breathable air supply. At current consumption, accounting for the fact that the Vethoran's respiratory needs were lower than human baseline, of approximately 19 hours remaining at time we established contact. We had made it with 11 hours to spare. The technical officer finished his report and then, after a pause long enough that I noticed it, said something our translator rendered as, "We acknowledge your arrival. We did not anticipate," and then stopped, and after another pause said, "We will coordinate with your engineering team," I said. "Understood. We are beginning descent to dock approach." I asked for his name for the operations log. He gave it. "Karath Engineer Velsoran," I said. "Engineer Velsoran. Please have your team ready for an external hull assessment team at dock ring 7 in 40 minutes," he said. "Acknowledged. Captain." That was the first exchange. 40 seconds, give or take, formal and precise on both sides. And somewhere, inside the precision of it was everything that needed to be said, and that neither of us was saying. I noted in my personal log that evening that it was the most interesting 40 seconds of my professional career up to that point, and I have never revised that assessment. What followed was 16 hours of intensive work. I am going to describe it in this necessary detail, because I think the detail matters, not for any strategic or procedural reason, because it is important to understand what 11 ships actually means on the ground, or in this case on the seabed. It means something specific and large and relentless, and the Vethoran experienced it in ways that I observed closely, and that their own subsequent accounts have not fully captured. Because there are things that are very hard to describe from the inside. The engineering barges docked at the station's external repair rings. 2 of them adapted to our docking configuration in real time by Velsoran's team, who were fast and skilled, and had clearly decided that they were going to be fast and skilled, regardless of who was on the other end of the docking collar. My submersible team went out in their hardened suits within 20 minutes of our arrival and began the external hull assessment. They had Karath's structural schematics, which Velsoran had transmitted immediately upon our request. No hesitation, no bureaucratic friction, no request for authorization from a superior level. In an emergency, the Vethoran were efficient. The fracture site at Sector 7 Delta was located within 40 minutes, and the assessment team had a full structural map transmitted back to the engineering barge commanders within the hour. The repair sequence they designed over the next 90 minutes was one of the more impressive pieces of field engineering I have seen in 8 years of running operations like this. The hull patching systems we had brought were rated for the pressure environment, but had not been designed specifically for Vethoran construction standards, which use a different alloy family than human engineering prefers, and which bond at a different thermal profile. The lead engineer on Barge 3, a woman named Chief Petty Officer Hannah Voss, spent 90 minutes in direct technical exchange with Velsoran's team, and what emerged from that exchange was a patch protocol that combined their materials knowledge with our system's capability in a way that neither side could have achieved alone. This is the part that I want the committee reports to have captured, and that I am not certain they did. The technical collaboration was not human expertise rescuing Vethoran incompetence. It was 2 engineering traditions working on a problem that required both, and both working as if the outcome mattered more than who got credit for the solution. Because it did, and because Velsoran's team, in those 90 minutes, were not thinking about the vote 11 years ago or the speech in the council chamber. They were engineers with a station that needed fixing, and so were we. The hull patch was initiated at hour 4 of our on-site operation. It took 6 hours to complete, 2 hours of external preparation, 3 hours of bonding cycle under pressure monitoring, 1 hour of integrity testing. The fracture site held. The pressure manifold repair took an additional 4 hours and required 2 of our submersible team to work in open methane sea conditions at depth, while Velsoran's internal team ran the manifold's pressure equalization sequence. This was, by any assessment, dangerous work. I logged it as such. My 2 crew members, Petty Officer 2nd Class Ren Halva and Specialist Tova Dresk, completed it without incident and were back aboard Persistent Dawn before hour 11, cold and tired and in need of the hot meal that the galley had been told to have ready. While the engineering work was ongoing, the hospital ship, Meridian Grace, had established a medical interface with Karath's medical station and was supporting the 3 Vethoran Individuals who had suffered acute respiratory compromise from the reduced circulation environment on levels 3 and 4. The Vethafron's respiratory biology is different from ours in ways that complicated the treatment protocol, but our chief medical officer had been in contact with Kareth's station physician from the moment we arrived, and they had worked out the necessary adaptations within the first 2 hours. All 3 patients survived. The station physician, whose name I was given as Kareth Healer Essa Veldrath, sent a formal communication to Meridian Grace that our translationings rendered as something close to, "Your medicines are strange and your techniques are stranger, but your results are sound." Our chief medical officer, who has a good sense of humor, responded that this was the best professional review she had ever received, and that she intended to have it framed. At hour 14, the oxygen recirculation system on levels 3 and 4 was restored. The engineering team ran a full cycle test, confirmed stable atmospheric mix on both levels, and gave the clearance for the 91 veteran who had been evacuated to levels 1 and 2 turn to their normal station areas. I was watching the internal imaging feed that Velsaran's team had given us access to, standard practice, so we could monitor for secondary incidents, and I watched them go back. They moved the way veteran move, measured, deliberate, that deep water weight to every motion. Some of them stopped in the corridors of levels 3 and 4, and simply stood there for a moment before, continuing. I did not know and do not know what that pause meant in their terms, but I recognized the shape of it. I have seen humans stand in a room they thought they would never see again, and not immediately move, and the pause has a particular quality that I think is not entirely specific to our species. At hour 16, the hull integrity test came back clean and Chief Voss certified the repair as complete. The pressure manifold was at 91%. She recommended monitoring but assessed as stable for full operation. She transmitted a maintenance schedule to Velsaran's team with recommendations for the next inspection cycle. He transmitted back that the recommendations had been received and would be implemented. I logged the operation as complete. We held station for an additional 6 hours, standard protocol after a critical repair, to ensure no secondary incidents developed. I used some of that time to the operational summary. I used some of it to walk the ship and speak with crew, and I used some of it on the 3rd hour of that hold to accept a communication request that my comm officer flagged as originating from the Kareth Station administrative level, not the engineering team and not the medical station, but the administrative level, which housed the philosophical casta, members who ran the station's governance functions. The individual who appeared on my screen, and I use appeared loosely, because the veteran imaging systems produced a rendering that was accurate to their physiology. But that required a moment of cognitive adjustment. First viewing, given the scale and the particulars of their form, was identified by the translation tag as Kareth Administrator Vel Oran, which meant I was informed by my liaison officer in a quick side message. This was a member of the Oran lineage, the same lineage as Depth Counselor Oran Velthesk, who had given the 3-hour speech 11 years ago. The administrator did not begin by stating this. She began by stating that she had been asked to convey the formal gratitude of Kareth Station to the relief convoy, and that the formal gratitude would be transmitted in full through the standard diplomatic channels within the standard response window. I said, "Thank you, Administrator. That is appreciated." There was a pause. In my experience, pauses in diplomatic communications between species are rarely accidents. "Something is being decided in them," she said. "I have a question that is not part of the formal gratitude. It is a personal question, and you are not obligated to answer it." I said, "Go ahead," she said. "When your relay received our distress signal, you were on the far side of the transit corridor. You had no prior coordination with us. You had no treaty obligation. Your Assembly's application for council membership was declined in part because of our representative's testimony," I said. "That is all accurate," she said. "Then why did you come?" It was not a question the way questions are usually asked. Shh. It was said with the flatness of something that genuinely did not have an answers, that the speaker could construct from available information. She was not performing curiosity. She was asking because she did not know, and not knowing was, for a veteran of her caste, Apparently a state serious enough to warrant a personal question to a foreign military officer while the welding on the hull was still cooling. Thought about it for a moment. Not because I did not know the answer. I had known the answer for years. Since before Kareth, since before the vote, since before I made captain. But I wanted to give her the real answer and not the official one, and it took me a moment to find the words that were both true and simple enough to travel across the translation gap without losing their meaning. I said, "Administrator, in our service we have a standing protocol for distress signals. The protocol says that when a distress signal is received, first question we ask is not who sent it. The first question is whether we can help. If the answer is yes, we go. The vote 11 years ago was a council matter. The people on levels 3 and 4 of Kareth Station were not a council matter. They were 400 people in a failing structure 11 kilometers underwater, and we could help. So we went. She was quiet for longer than the previous pauses, long enough that I wondered if the connection had dropped. Then she said, "Your council application was denied because our representative argued that a species which had not learned to descend could not be trusted with deep decisions." I said. "I know," she said. 11 of your ships descended to bring us air. I did not say anything to that. There was nothing that needed saying." She said something then in her own language, that the translation system did not render. Not because the translation failed. The system was running correctly. I could see the input processing. But because whatever she said was either untranslatable or she had deliberately used a register outside the translation parameters. It was 2 words, or what sounded like 2 words in the subsonic range, and the resonance of them came through the comm system as something felt as much as heard, frequency, that sat in the chest rather than in the ear. My liaison officer afterward told me that she had a hypothesis about what Vel Oran had said, based on her study of Veth Oran philosophical language. She thought it was a phrase from their deep liturgy tradition, a saying used in the context of moral recalibration, a position being reassessed in light of evidence. Something close to in her translation. The depth was not where I was looking. I am not certain that translation is right. But it is the closest thing I have to a record of that moment, and I have kept it. We departed Kareth Station at hour 22 of the operation. Standard convoy departure, by the numbers, nothing ceremonial. Vel Saran's engineering team was on the external docking ring as we undocked, visible on the hull cameras, of them in their environment suit, which are bulky things suited for the methane sea rather than vacuum, and which give the Veth Oran a somewhat different silhouette than they have unsuited. They held position on the ring as we pulled away. I do not know Veth Oran body language well enough to say with certainty what their posture conveyed. My liaison officer said it looked like a send-off. I thought it looked like something more specific than that. The posture of beings watching, someone leave who had done something they did not fully understand, and were not quite ready to stop watching. The ascent through 11 kilometers of amber methane sea took 4 hours. It was quieter than the descent, as returns usually are. Crew were tired in the good way. The way you are tired after work that went the way it was supposed to go. When the thing that needed doing got done, and everyone who needed to be kept alive is still alive. Lieutenant Dreshko brought coffee to the bridge at the 2-kilometer mark. The lights of the station were below us and diminishing, that violet pulse getting smaller as we rose, until at 4 kilometers it was a faint heartbeat in the amber dark, and then nothing at all. We broke surface at 0319 station time, nearly exactly 48 hours after the distress signal went out. The Chevrek Unconfederation's preliminary assessment team arrived at the transit point 4 hours later, having completed their standard mobilization window. Their convoy commander hailed us as we were processing departure clearance. He was polite and professional. He said he was sorry to see the situation had been resolved and asked if there was anything his team could provide. Kareth station crew in the aftermath. I told him I thought the Kareth team would appreciate the contact, and gave him Vel Saran's frequency. He thanked me. I did not say anything else. There was nothing useful to be gained from it, and I was tired, and the Chevrek commander was doing his job within his system's constraints, and that was not his fault. But I noted the timestamp. The Drevan Technocracy's message arrived 6 hours after we surfaced. They had identified a contractor team with appropriate environmental ratings and were prepared to arrange deployment within 72 to 96 hours, pending contract finalization. I noted that timestamp too. The Galactic Steering Council sent a formal acknowledgement of the Karath emergency and a commendation of the response effort 4 days later. The commendation was addressed to the responding species and any affiliated organizations, rather than to Earth or to the Human Deep Space Relief Command by name. I have been told by people who understand council politics better than I do that this was a deliberate choice, and that naming Earth specifically would have required a procedural motion that certain council members were not prepared to support. The language was crafted to allow the commendation to exist, without implying anything about the membership question. I have kept that document too, in the same file as my operational log from Karath. The formal Vethoran diplomatic response came 8 days after our departure. It was, as Vel Oran had promised, transmitted through the standard channel and was written in the formal register, their diplomatic service uses for official correspondence. It ran to 6 pages. I will not quote it here because diplomatic documents of that kind are full of formal language that presses badly when reduced to summary, and the meaning lives in the full register rather than in any particular sentence. What I will say is that it was complete. It did not minimize what had happened or frame the rescue in terms that softened the disparity between what the Vethoran's allies had provided and what we had. It named the 11 ships. It named the crew count. It described the hull repair and the medical response and the oxygen restoration in specific technical detail, and it used language that my liaison officer said was the diplomatic equivalent of an accounting, a clear-eyed statement of what had occurred, recorded for the archive, with nothing softened and nothing elided. At the end, in a section that carried a different formal register than the rest of the document, a register my liaison officer identified as belonging to the Vethoran's philosophical administrative tradition, rather than their diplomatic service. There was a single paragraph that I will reproduce here, because I think it belongs in the record. The translation reads, "It is the position of the Karath Administrative Council that the events of this period constitute evidence requiring revision of certain previously held assessments. The species known as humanity demonstrated, in the period of crisis, a capacity for decisive and technically competent action at extended range and in conditions of significant difficulty, combined with the discipline in the application of that capacity that the Administrative Council had not previously recorded in its assessments of this species. The Administrative Council further notes that this capacity was deployed without precondition, without reference to prior political dispute, and without withdrawal or diminishment at any stage of the operation. These are qualities the Administrative Council associates with depth. The Administrative Council has requested that this observation be transmitted to the appropriate bodies of the Galactic Steering Council for their consideration." I read that paragraph 4 times when it arrived. Then I sent it to Admiral Caro with a 1-line cover note that said, "For your record, sir." He replied within the hour with 3 words, "Well done, Captain. That was enough. I want to return now to the question that people ask me. Why did you go? They mocked you. Their council rep gave a 3-hour speech and called you unfit for serious civilization. Why did you show up anyway with 11 ships and spend 16 hours fixing their station?" I have given several answers to this in the years since Karath, and none of them have been dishonest exactly. Some of them have been more diplomatic than true. In front of committees I talk about standing protocols and humanitarian obligations and the value of demonstrated good faith in galactic relations. In the Academy lectures I talk about the strategic logic of being the species that answers, the long-term case for showing up everywhere, always regardless of prior politics. All of that is true. I believe all of it. But the answer I gave Vel Oran on that comm connection, in the amber dark of the methane sea with the welding on the hull still cooling, that is, truest one. When the distress signal came in at 0409, and I was standing at my desk with the coffee brewing, I read it and thought, 91 beings on failing life support, 19 hours of air, 11 kilometers of ocean on top of them, and the species that had the greatest claim on their gratitude had promised a preliminary assessment team in 48 hours. And I thought, we can get there first. Not to prove something, not to collect a debt, not to be there when they realized who had come and who hadn't, although I will not pretend there was no satisfaction in the math of the timestamps. I thought, we can get there first, and if we go right now, the 91 people on levels 3 and 4 will still be breathing when we arrive. That was the whole calculation. It was not a complicated one. The Vetharan submitted a formal proposal to reopen the question of Earth's Council membership 7 months after the Karath operation. The proposal cited, among other things, the Administrative Council's paragraph about depth. The vote, when it came, was 11 species in favor. Earth required 8. We got the seat. Depth Councillor Aran Velthesk, the representative who had given the 3-hour speech 11 years earlier, retired from the council 2 years before the vote. Her successor cast the Vetharan vote in favor. I do not know, and have never been told, what Velthesk thought of the vote outcome, or of Karath, or of the paragraph about depth that came from her own civilization's administrative council. Possibly she thought nothing. Possibly she had revised her assessment in the same direction that Veloran had suggested quietly in that untranslated phrase at the end of our conversation. Possibly she thought both things at once, which is also something that happens. What I know is that on the day the council vote result was transmitted to Deep Space Command, Admiral Caro called me on a private channel and read me the result, and then did not say anything for a moment, and then said, the preliminary assessment team, Olin, the Chevrak, 48 hours. I said yes. 4 hours and 22 minutes after we surfaced, he said. 8. Dismissed. I have kept that conversation in the same file as everything else. There is one more thing I want to include in this account, because I think it belongs here, even though it has no place in an operational log or a formal report. 6 months after Karath, after the diplomatic response before the council proposal, I received a private message. It was not routed through diplomatic channels, and it was not in the formal register of the Vethoran Administrative Service. It was flagged by our message handling system as personal correspondence, origin Karath Station, sender identified as Karath Engineer Vel Soran. It was 14 words long. Our translation system rendered it as, the manifold held through the winter pressure cycle. Chief Voss calibrated it well. That was all I wrote back. I told him I was glad to hear it, and that Chief Voss would be pleased to know her work was holding. I asked how the station was running. He replied the following day. He said the station was running well. He said the inspection cycle that Chief Voss had recommended had caught a secondary stress point in a support coupling that might otherwise have gone unnoticed until it became a problem. He said the engineering team had addressed it in the 2nd month after our departure. He said they had written up the procedure using the combined protocol that his team and Chief Voss had developed during the repair, and that they had submitted it to the Kara Station Technical Archive as a new standard. He said, it is a good protocol. It works better than the one we had, I said. I will pass that along to Chief Voss, he said, please do. And there was a pause in the message. Not the kind that the translation system generates, but the kind that comes from someone stopping mid-composition. And then, please tell your crew that the engineers cast of Karath Station considers the work that was done here to be of the highest standard. We have a word for this in our language that I do not know if your translation system will carry. It means something close to worthy of the deep. Translation system carried it. I told Chief Voss that evening in the mess. She nodded once. The way she nods when something has been logged and filed internally where it will stay. Then she went back to her dinner. That was the right response. I put it in my file and went back to mine. Worthy of the deep, 11 ships, 16 hours. 19 hours of air left when we arrived, and we arrived with 11 hours to spare. That was what we brought them. I have been asked, in the years since, whether I think Depth Councillor Velthesk was wrong. Whether the speech was wrong, whether the vote was wrong, whether the assessment that humanity had not learned to descend was wrong. I think it was wrong when she gave it. I think she may have had reasons that were not unreasonable. We were a younger species, less experienced in the kind of measured long-term thinking that a galactic governance body requires, more prone to the thrashing she described. I think those concerns were not entirely without basis 11 years ago. I also think that the vote and the speech and the language about the surface and the depth produced in us something that might not have been produced otherwise. Not anger, exactly. Something more useful than anger. A particular kind of discipline. The discipline of showing up everywhere, always, at scale, without precondition. Until the question of whether we belonged at the table answered itself through the accumulating evidence. The Vethoran have a philosophy built around the idea that depth equals truth. The deeper you go, the more honest the world becomes. I went 11 kilometers down into an amber methane sea to bring air to people who had said, we weren't worth a seat at the table. I brought 11 ships, because that was what the job required. I stayed 16 hours, because that was how long the job took. I did not require anything in return, because that was not what the protocol asked for. And then I came back up. If that is not dissent, I do not know what is.